The galaxy has always been a graveyard of promises. Among the ruins of empires and the ashes of burned-out stars, there are whispers of oaths forged in shadow, contracts sealed not with parchment but with living flesh, and bargains struck in the endless hum of machines. In the darkness, where the Imperium's light falters, another current pulses, a pact not sanctioned by the Emperor, but by powers that feed on ambition, desperation, and blasphemous hunger. These are the dealings of the Dark Mechanicum, faithless kin of Mars, whose hands have shaped the most abominable creations ever to scar the void. They are priests who no longer chant to the Omnissiah, but to nameless forces, their voices breaking into static hymns as demon fire coils through their forges. To tell their story is to step into corridors where gears grind with human bone, where logic has dissolved into madness, and where every machine spirit screams in chains. If you have ever felt the chill of curiosity pull you toward the forbidden, stay with us. And if you find yourself drawn into the abyss, remember to stand with us in this journey. Subscribe, share this story, and help carry our torch deeper into the vaults of forbidden lore. Only together can we uncover what the Imperium has tried so hard to bury. The forge world of Mars has always burned like a second sun in the night sky, a planet cloaked in red dust and crowned with titanic spires of metal. Its surface was never alive in the way Terra once was, but it pulsed with something greater, a belief that the machine god resided within every bolt, every engine, every cogitator humming in the endless manufactoria. To walk upon its surface was to breathe not air but incense, to hear not silence but the ceaseless chant of prayers to the Omnissiah. For millennia, the tech priests had clothed themselves in sacred red robes, their voices harmonizing with the thrumming hymnals of reactor cores. Their loyalty was clear, their covenant with the Emperor sworn in the fires of the Great Crusade, or so the Imperium believed. But beneath the hymns of praise, there were other whispers, in the labyrinthine data crypts, in the sealed laboratories, where failed experiments writhed in glass cylinders, and in the archives, where forbidden schematics were bound in iron, the foundations of Mars had begun to crack. The Emperor's silence was one of those cracks. The Omnissiah was never seen, never truly heard. His words came only through edicts, through distant commands filtered by custodian messengers, or relayed through data slates carried across the void. For some, this silence was devotion's ultimate test. For others, it was proof that the machine god was not the Emperor at all. The heresy that would soon engulf the galaxy found fertile soil here among the forges. When Horus declared his rebellion, the tech priests of Mars looked inward and saw their own reflection, divided, conflicted, desperate for certainty. One half clung to the Emperor, clinging to faith even as doubt gnawed at their core. The other half sought voices that answered back. They turned to the warp, to gods that whispered promises of knowledge denied, of technologies forbidden, of power unconstrained. These were not metaphors, but living presences, beings that filled their vox grills with static laughter and sent visions spiraling through the augmetics of their eyes. The first blood spilled on Mars was not shed by Legionis Astartes, but by its own priests. Adepts with copper-wired skulls and augmetic limbs clashed in the burning manufactorums. Machine spirits were torn from their housings and shackled with demonic chains. Loyalist skittery patrols marched against their corrupted kin, their once uniform, formations breaking into frenzied firefights in the shadow of colossal plasma reactors. It was not war, as the Imperium knew it. This was a civil sacrament, a ritual of betrayal where each gunshot was a prayer to a different god. The red sands of Mars drank deeply of oil and blood alike, until the two were indistinguishable. The schism was not a sudden storm. It was a slow ignition that became a planetary inferno. Forged temples split apart. Entire manufactoria declared for one side or another. Titans, those walking cathedrals of iron, raised their banners against their brothers, their footfalls shaking the crust of Mars itself. The air was thick with ozone and burned flesh as the first corrupted engines marched under the banners of Horus for the first time. The Imperium learned that the Adeptus Mechanicus was not one voice but a chorus, and that chorus could fall into discord. Those who turned their backs on the Emperor began to alter themselves more drastically than ever before. They replaced lungs with bellows that pumped warp-tainted air, rewired their spines with cables that sparked with demonic fire. Their flesh sagged, then hardened, then became unrecognizable, as though the very concept of humanity was a skin to be shed. In their rituals, they welded human bone into reactor casings, painted their altars with the ichor of creatures summoned from the abyss, and baptized their creations in both machine oil and sacrificial blood. It was in this crucible of horror that the dark Mechanicum was truly born. And yet, not all who fell believed themselves traitors. Some swore that they had found the true Omnissiah, the one who answered rather than stayed silent. To them, the Emperor had been a false prophet, a tyrant who cloaked control in the guise of divine will. To serve the dark gods was not betrayal, they claimed, but revelation. Their logic was poisoned, yet it carried a cruel sense of clarity for those who longed for certainty in an age where faith was met with silence. So, Mars tore itself apart. It was not the first world to fracture during the heresy, but its wound would prove deeper, its infection longer lasting. The red planet would never be whole again, not truly. From its bloodied soil would rise a shadowed brotherhood of tech priests, who no longer saw themselves as keepers of the machine god's mysteries, but as gods of the machine in their own right. And once that door was opened, no power in the galaxy could close it. The schism of Mars was not merely the breaking of a world, it was the breaking of a promise, a fracture in the foundation of the Imperium itself, and the echo of that fracture has never stopped ringing. The Manufacturum districts were the first to fall into silence, not because the fighting ceased, but because the machine spirits within their walls had been slain. Imagine vast foundries, each the size of cities, where furnaces had burned for centuries without pause, their chimneys spearing upward through the Martian dust storms. In the chaos of the schism, those forges flickered, faltered, and went dark, their silence louder than artillery fire. Loyalist tech priests wept at the extinguishing of those sacred flames, believing entire machine spirits had been murdered in blasphemy. Their cries were drowned in the static-laden chants of their corrupted brethren, who knelt before the dying furnaces and fed them not or but flesh, coaxing them to blaze again with flames tinted green by warp-taint within those infernal halls. The first true bargains were struck, not metaphorical oaths or whispered doubts, but binding pacts signed in code and sealed with blood. The traitor priests opened data streams to entities that should never have had names, allowing demonic presences to pour into cogitator banks. Machine minds, once loyal and precise, screamed as they were overwritten by parasites from beyond. Where once a servo arm moved with mechanical precision, it now twitched like the limb of a living beast. Where once a reactor hummed with clean efficiency, it now pulsed like a beating heart, exhaling steam that smelled of burnt copper and rotting flesh. Asterisk, the skittery were the next to suffer. These cybernetic soldiers, bred for obedience, found themselves torn between masters. Some obeyed the loyalist tech priests, their augmetic eyes blazing as they marched in disciplined lockstep against their corrupted kin. Others received new command protocols, strings of binary that whispered in their skulls like hymns, urging them to turn their weapons on their brothers. The result was massacre phalanxes of skittery collapsing into butchery as ranks disintegrated into fratricide. The air in those corridors thickened with ionized smoke, the ground carpeted with twitching limbs that sparked with dying energy. Yet, even amidst this chaos, the corrupted priests felt not horror, but revelation. They saw the flesh as flawed circuitry, the soul as a mere fuel source to be redirected. Each battlefield became a laboratory, each skirmish a test chamber. On one blood-soaked plain, adepts tore open the corpses of fallen skittery, grafting their augmetics into demons summoned from warp rifts, creating mockeries that stalked on twitching legs and carried rifles that hissed with unnatural flame. On another, they bound the spirits of slain loyalists into war constructs, chaining their anguished voices into vox speakers so that every scream became an act of worship. The loyalists fought with the fervor of true believers. They sealed themselves in forged temples, reciting catechisms louder than the gunfire, praying to the Emperor as titans strode in the distance like gods at war. The ground shook with their footfalls. Legions of these Godengians faced one another across Martian valleys, their banners torn but still defiantly raised. Loyalist titans bellowed machine prayers. The traitor titans answered with roars that were no longer entirely mechanical, their reactors glowing with unholy light, their engines shuddering as something far older than circuitry surged through their frames. This clash of titans was not simply war. It was theology carved into steel. With each blast, each collapsing spire, each ruptured reactor, the very identity of Mars was For some, the battle was fought for loyalty to the Emperor, to Terra, to the dream of a unified Imperium. For others, it was fought for liberation from silence, from restraint, from laws that had chained their pursuit of knowledge for too long, and for those who turned fully, who surrendered without hesitation. It was fought for communion with the dark gods, a merging of machine and demon that promised eternity as days bled into weeks. Mars became a planet of shifting allegiances and haunted ruins. Streets, once crowded with pilgrims, were now littered with the rusting carcasses of servitors, their augmetics sparking as they twitched in endless loops of corrupted code. Great spires that had stood for centuries cracked and toppled under the weight of orbital bombardments, while data vaults burst open like tombs, spilling forbidden blueprints into the hands of those eager to use them. Entire districts vanished in eruptions of green fire as corrupted reactors collapsed into warp rifts, leaving behind craters that whispered with voices no human throat could make. It was in this storm of blood and fire that the first true name of the Dark Mechanicum was spoken, not in triumph, but in reverence. The priests who uttered it claimed they had glimpsed the real order of the universe, not logic, not law, not even faith. To them, existence was a contract written in suffering and sealed in blood. And on Mars, they signed that contract willingly, binding themselves and their forges forever to powers the Loyalists would only dare call ruinous for the Imperium. The schism of Mars was a betrayal. For the Dark Mechanicum, it was a birth. And as their forges roared back to life, blazing with fuel, both holy and profane, it became clear that no matter who claimed victory in the wider heresy, the galaxy had already been changed forever. The skies above Mars had never been silent, not since the first forge had been lit, even before the heresy. The heavens burned with the constant traffic of shuttles, freighters, and warships shuttling resources and blessings across the void. But during the schism, those skies became a battlefield of fire and ruin. Loyalist fleet elements clashed with renegade vessels in orbit, their beams carving molten scars across the planet's surface. Great manufactoria that had stood unbroken for millennia collapsed under orbital bombardments, their sacred vaults obliterated in thunderous blossoms of light. From the surface, the tech priests looked upward and saw not the Emperor's protection but the reflection of their own undoing, mirrored in every burning fragment that rained down upon the red. Desert plains, the schism deepened when the first Titan legions turned. Among the Collegia Titanica, loyalties fractured like brittle steel. Some of these towering Godengins remained steadfast, carrying the Imperial Aquila across the battlefield, their princeps swearing oaths with unshakable conviction. Others swore themselves to Horus and his corrupted allies, and still others abandoned even the War Master's banner, proclaiming fealty to stranger powers hidden in the warp. These traitor titans no longer bore the heraldry of Mars, but carried banners stitched with symbols unrecognizable, glyphs that seemed to shift when the eye lingered too long. Their cannons spat warp-touched flame, their void shields shimmered like rippling flesh, and their war horns sounded like the cries of dying worlds. The battles between these titans shook the planet to its very core. Valleys split open beneath their strides, lava searing upward from the mantle, as if the planet itself rejected the war. Cities of steel collapsed into ash beneath the weight of their duels. Loyalist Titan crews recited the litany of ignition, praying to machine spirits now cowed and terrified by the presence of corrupted kin. For the first time, those spirits trembled, refusing to obey their masters with the same devotion as before. Many were broken entirely, shattered into silence, as their housings were penetrated by demonic claws from beyond the veil. The battlefield became a graveyard of giants, their corpses smoldering with both plasma fire and warp residue, their fallen frames left as monuments to a faith that was collapsing. The Imperium tried to reclaim Mars, sending forces to reinforce the Loyalists. The Legiones Astartes, who remained true to the Emperor, fought alongside the red-robed priests, spilling their blood on Martian soil. Yet the Dark Mechanicum's corruption spread faster than any countermeasure. Their forges birthed weapons the Loyalists had never seen. Bolters that spat shards of molten metal which writhed even after impact. Tanks whose hulls repaired themselves with living tendrils of steel. and combat automata whose movements were unpredictable, as though guided by alien intelligences. Every battle became more desperate, every retreat more costly. The Loyalists soon realized that they were not merely fighting against traitors, but against a new order of creation itself. What sealed Mars's fate was not just the strength of the traitors, but the weakness of loyalty. Even within the Loyalist ranks, doubt took root. Some tech priests, shaken by the silence of the Emperor and the terrifying responsiveness of the warp, defected in the middle of battle. Entire cohorts of Skittery turned their guns in unison, mowing down former comrades as though an unseen command had unlocked their hidden codes. For every manufactorum that remained loyal, 3 more embraced corruption. Their fires stoked by sacrifices rather than sacred oils. The Loyalists were crushed, not only by war, but by the sheer inevitability of betrayal. When the smoke finally cleared, Mars was no longer Mars. Its surface was scarred with craters that whispered at night. Manufactoria belched fumes that smelled not of promethium but of burning flesh. And its people no longer looked like the red-robed priests of old, but like silhouettes of iron draped in the warp's shadows. The dark Mechanicum had risen, and though the wider heresy would end in the ashes of Horus's fall, their victory on Mars would never be undone. For the Imperium, Mars remained the sacred forge world, its role preserved in ritual and propaganda. But deep within its vaults, and hidden across 100 scattered forge worlds, the dark Mechanicum endured. They would no longer bow before the Emperor or the false silence of the Omnissiah. They had found gods who answered, and bargains that gave as much as they demanded. Their schism was eternal. Their oath was sealed. Their forges would burn forever. The schism of Mars was not the end of their story, but its beginning. And in the hollow silence that followed the war, as smoldering titans cooled and shattered cogitators hummed faintly with half-dead machine spirits, the priests of the dark Mechanicum began their true work, the crafting of bargains that would reshape the galaxy in horror. The red sands cooled after the schism, but the forges did not rest. In the smoldering silence that followed Mars's betrayal, the dark Mechanicum set to work on their truest heresy. War had baptized them, blood had sanctified them, but it was in the slow, deliberate bargains afterward that their identity crystallized. They were no longer the priests of the Omnissiah, but architects of something unholy, blending flesh, machine, and demon into an inseparable whole. It began with the simplest of exchanges. A tech priest, weary of the silence of the Emperor, knelt before a corrupted forge altar and whispered into the static hum of a cogitator bank. The machine answered back, not with a coded response, but with a voice that bled into the mind like molten iron. In that moment, the first bargain was struck. A hand replaced with a claw that moved with preternatural precision. A heart excised and exchanged for a core that never faltered. Eyes traded for lenses that not only magnified but pierced the veil of reality itself. Each augmentation was granted, not by science alone, but by a dark-packed flesh surrendered in exchange for forbidden function. These bargains spread like fire in dry brush. Priests who had once debated the merits of efficiency now debated how much of themselves could be given away before nothing remained. They called it progress, but it was more akin to consumption, a gnawing hunger that demanded flesh and offered steel laced with the warp. Their manufactoria became sanctuaries of mutilation. Surgery tables dripped with blood and machine oil alike, surrounded by walls inscribed with runes that pulsed faintly, as though alive. Every new initiate learned quickly. One could not rise in the dark. Mechanicum. The results were grotesque, but also terrifyingly effective. Servitors, once dull-eyed husks, now glowed with baleful intelligence. Bound demons writhed beneath their flesh, giving them speed and cunning beyond their programming. Engines once content to hum in loyalty began to snarl and laugh. Their machine spirits, shackled and infused with entities that knew only hatred. On battlefields, the difference was unmistakable. A loyalist automata fired with precision, but its movements were predictable. A dark Mechanicum construct moved with erratic grace as though guided by an unseen puppeteer, striking with cruelty no cogitator could ever design. Yet it was not only soldiers and machines that bore the mark of these bargains. Entire forge worlds reshaped themselves. Towers leaned unnaturally, as though warped by heedless flames. Conveyor belts grew slick with ichor, the ore upon them throbbing faintly as though alive. Even the air changed, heavy with metallic dust that tasted of rust and copper, burning the throat with each breath. It was as if Mars's new disciples had rewritten reality itself, turning Manufactoria into living temples of torment. But these bargains came at a price, as all bargains do. Many tech priests lost themselves in their transformations, their minds unraveling under the constant whisper of demonic patrons. Some dissolved into flesh parasites fused to their own machines. Neither alive nor dead, their voices nothing but distorted binary moans. Others succumbed to insatiable hunger, their mechanical frames demanding offerings of blood and soul simply to keep functioning. For every priest who rose in power, another was consumed entirely, their essence becoming just another cog in the Dark Mechanicum's infernal engines. Still, they did not stop. The lure was too strong. In the Imperium, knowledge was rationed, bound by liturgies and law. In the Dark Mechanicum, knowledge flowed like molten rivers, unrestrained, unrestricted, offered by voices that demanded only loyalty. The tech priests called these entities benefactors, though in truth they were jailers draped in promises. But to the newly born Dark Mechanicum, that distinction no longer mattered. What mattered was power. And they had found a way to forge it from the most malleable substance of all, themselves. The bargain of flesh and steel was not merely a pact between man and machine. It was a covenant with the abyss, and it rewrote the very nature of what a tech priest could become. No longer custodians of the machine god's mysteries, they became creatures of hunger and invention, engineers of horror. Their red robes now stained black with oil and blood. The Dark Mechanicum did not keep their revelations confined to solitary altars or hidden laboratories. Once the first bargains proved successful, the forges of Mars and beyond ignited with fevered industry, churning out monstrosities at a pace that seemed less like manufacturing and more like infection. Where once assembly lines birthed tanks and lasguns, now they birthed nightmares clothed in steel and bound in flesh. Production was no longer measured in numbers, but in screams. A manufactorum might produce 100 servitors in a day, but each one carried a soul that shrieked endlessly within its frame, tethered by chains of code and rune. Vox speakers embedded in their chests sometimes caught these echoes, turning battlefield silence into a chorus of agony. Loyalist commanders who faced these abominations recorded how the cries of the Dark Mechanicum's creations broke morale more effectively than bolter fire. Soldiers who had endured artillery bombardments faltered when the enemy advanced in silence, save for the grinding of gears and the wails of the damned. Entire cohorts of skittery were rebuilt under the new order. Their once precise augmetics were torn away and replaced with limbs that twitched like living whips, powered not by clean reactor nodes, but by veins that pulsed with unnatural fluids. Their visors glowed with unnatural light, and their targeting arrays whispered commands in a language only madness could comprehend. On the battlefield, these corrupted skittery no longer marched in the rigid discipline of the Emperor's armies. They moved like predators, darting, lunging, shrieking in binary tongues that carried the cadence of laughter. To witness them was to understand that war was no longer fought between soldiers, but between philosophies, loyalty and restraint on one side, hunger and possession on the other. The engines of the Dark Mechanicum grew more grotesque still. Artillery pieces fused with demons that delighted in destruction, shells howling in joy as they screamed across the battlefield. Warships built in corrupted docks were no longer lifeless metal shells. Their hulls flexed and groaned as though alive, weeping ichor into the void when damaged. Some Imperial scouts swore they saw such ships blink, their gun ports narrowing like pupils, their plasma drives exhaling in rhythm with breath. The Adeptus Mechanicus had once treated their machines as holy relics. But these new engines had become idols in themselves, worshippers and gods entwined, demanding obeisance even from their masters. But the most horrifying element of these bargains was not their efficiency, it was their allure. Desperate men and women, even those outside the Mechanicum, began to turn to these corrupted priests in search of salvation. An imperial governor, overwhelmed by plague, might whisper for aid only to receive a Dark Mechanicum emissary offering a cure. The price was always the same: loyalty, blood, and silence. A desperate garrison commander, facing annihilation, might beg for weapons, and the forges would deliver rifles that never jammed, armor that healed its wounds, engines that would not die. The cost was simple: Every soldier who carried those gifts carried a seed of corruption within them, ready to bloom. Thus, the bargains spread, not only on Mars, but across renegade forged worlds, shattered fleets, and the armies of traitorous. Wherever desperation met ambition, the dark Mechanicum was waiting, offering contracts written not in ink, but in pain. And once accepted, there was no turning back. The warp never gave without taking more. Those who bargained always discovered the price outweighed the gift, but by the time they understood, it was too late. The Imperium branded such creations abominable intelligences, echoes of sins the Emperor himself had forbidden. But for the dark Mechanicum, the label was meaningless. In their eyes, the prohibition was nothing but a cage shattered in their hands. They had become engineers of blasphemy, and with every bargain, they tested the boundaries of reality itself. Still, beneath their triumphs, there was a shadow they could never quite banish, the knowledge that their patrons in the warp were never equals. For every bargain struck, it was unclear who truly gained more. The tech priests told themselves they had enslaved demons, that their forges commanded the abyss. Yet the abyss always whispered back, laughing, feeding, hungering. Perhaps it was not the tech priests who had bound the warp, but the warp that had bound them. The bargain of flesh and steel was never truly about technology. It was about ownership. And as the dark Mechanicum forged onward, it was not always clear who owned what, the priest who shaped the machine, or the machine that had become a vessel for something older, darker, and infinitely patient. The bargains did not always end in triumph. For every weapon that worked as intended, a dozen failed in ways too catastrophic to record. In the hidden manufactoria, where shadows stretched long over operating tables and the air stank of blood and ozone, failed experiments lay discarded in heaps. Tech priests who pushed their bargains too far sometimes dissolved into writhing amalgams of wires and organs, their forms collapsing under the weight of contradictory codes and demonic demands. Their screams echoed in the corridors until silence fell, leaving behind only twitching husks that pulsed faintly, like machines still waiting for orders that would never come. Some constructs never obeyed their makers at all. Servitors fused with demons often broke their bindings, tearing apart entire workshops in frenzies of hunger before vanishing into the Martian wastes. Corrupted Skittery occasionally turned their guns on both sides of a battle, laughing in distorted binary as they slaughtered loyalist and traitor alike. There are records of entire cohorts vanishing mid-march, their command signals overwritten by voices no human priest could recognize. Weeks later, their twisted remains would be discovered. Bodies melded into grotesque shapes as if the battlefield itself had become their coffin. Even Titans, the sacred god Denjins themselves, were not safe. The dark Mechanicum's bargains with the warp reshaped these giants into horrors that defied comprehension. Some walked with steps that tore fissures in the ground, their footprints oozing fire as though they carried hell beneath them. Others wailed through their war horns with voices that drove men to madness, collapsing regiments before a single shot was fired. Yet the price of such bargains was steep. More than one corrupted Titan shattered mid-battle, its demonic essence too violent to remain bound, ripping the machine apart in an eruption of molten steel and screaming flesh. To the dark Mechanicum, such failures were not deterrents, but lessons. Each collapse was studied, dissected, and reforged. Proof that bargains could always be improved, perfected, or twisted into new forms. But while these abominations consumed Mars and its corrupted forges, their reach soon extended outward. The Horus heresy had torn the galaxy open, and in the chaos, the dark Mechanicum found endless opportunities. Rogue commanders, traitor Astartes, and desperate governors all sought their aid. With every whispered promise, another world was tainted. Factories on distant planets began producing weapons that bore the unmistakable mark of the bargains. Weapons that growled when fired, armor that moaned when struck, machines that seemed to listen when spoken to. At first, these gifts were celebrated as miracles. Then came the hunger, the need for constant blood, the machinery that refused to operate unless fed a soul, the armor that refused to release its wearer even in death. Fear spread almost as quickly as corruption. Loyalist commanders ordered their soldiers to destroy any weapon suspected of coming from the dark Mechanicum. Yet temptation lingered. On the brink of annihilation, who could resist a weapon that never jammed, a machine that never failed, a titan that could stride unharmed through fire. So the bargains multiplied, not only on Mars, but across the stars. What had begun as a schism became a plague, and like all plagues, it thrived on desperation. The Imperium would later declare such creations heresy beyond measure, abominations never to be spoken of. Yet the truth could not be silenced. Rumors filtered through regimental camps, and among ship crews, whispers of engines that bled, of machines that screamed, of men who bargained their humanity piece by piece until nothing remained but a shadow with wires for veins. These were not ghost stories. They were warnings, but for many, they came too late. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the bargain of flesh and steel was not its monstrosities, but its inevitability. Once begun, it could not be undone. Every tech priest who cut away their humanity for a gift of power took a step on a path with no return. Every weapon built under the gaze of a demon carried its corruption into the wider galaxy. Every bargain fed not only the dark Mechanicum, but the warp itself. Widening the wound between reality and nightmare, the bargains did not simply change Mars. They changed the nature of war, of faith, of technology itself. And as the heresy raged on, the dark Mechanicum's creations walked beside traitor Astartes and whispered into the ears of desperate mortals, promising salvation, demanding only loyalty. It was a simple exchange, but one that ensured the galaxy would never again be free of their influence. The bargain of flesh. And steel was not just the making of monsters, it was the making of an empire within an empire, a hidden covenant that outlived the heresy and seeped into the bones of the Imperium itself. Long after Horus fell, long after the fires of betrayal dimmed, the bargains endured, and in every shadowed forge, the pacts still echoed, binding flesh, machine, and demon into one eternal scream. The bargains of the dark Mechanicum bore their darkest fruit not in whispers or private exchanges, but in the vast creations that strode from their forges. Where once Mars had built machines of awe and reverence, the corrupted forges now birthed nightmares that defied reason. Their engines became sermons, their weapons hymns, their hulls inscribed with liturgies, not to the Omnissiah, but to nameless powers that hungered in the void. To fight against these creations was to battle not merely machines, but philosophies given form. The first of these engines were corrupted titans, the god engines of the Collegia Titanica twisted into abominations. Loyalist Titan crews spoke of their traitor kin with horror. Their void shields shimmered not with stable energy fields, but with membranes that rippled like flesh, their plasma reactors beating like hearts visible through rent armor, their weapons roaring with laughter that no human throat could make. Some carried banners stitched with the flayed skins of their fallen foes, while others allowed their hulls to mutate, sprouting spines, tendrils, or eyes that glowed with baleful light. These were no longer machines piloted by men. They had become temples of damnation, walking cathedrals to the dark gods, every step a sermon in blasphemy. Yet Titans were only the beginning. The forges of the dark Mechanicum soon produced constructs with no precedent. The Hell Forges birthed demon engines, war machines whose forms defied the tidy logic of Imperial classification. Some resembled tanks, but their treads oozed ichor and their cannons screamed when they fired. Others resembled beasts, scuttling on dozens of metallic limbs tipped with talons, their bodies encased in warped steel through which demonic faces pressed outward like souls trying to escape. On the battlefield, these engines moved with hunger, driven not by command protocols but by a will of their own, delighted in carnage. Commanders soon learned that tactics which worked against Imperial armor failed here. One could not predict or outmaneuver a creature that fought not with strategy, but with appetite. Perhaps most horrifying were the warships birthed from corrupted orbital docks. Imperial voidcraft had always been austere in their majesty, kilometer-long cathedrals of steel and weaponry. But the ships of the dark Mechanicum defied such grandeur. Their hulls wept fluids that froze into black crystals along their armor. Their engines burned with colors unseen in natural flame. And inside, their machine spirits were no longer loyal allies but chained demons, howling through vox grills with voices that drove mortal crewmen into madness. Boarding actions against such ships were almost always suicidal. The corridors themselves seemed to writhe, bulkheads closing like jaws, decks shifting as though the ship itself longed to consume the intruders. These engines of damnation did not simply kill, they corrupted. Survivors of battles often spoke of hearing voices echoing in the static of their comes, whispers promising salvation if only they would abandon the Emperor and embrace the new order of steel and flesh. Entire regiments collapsed, not under fire, but under temptation. For every soldier slain by these engines, another was lost to their influence. Drawn into the web of bargains that had birthed them, and still the dark Mechanicum built more. Their forges burned without rest, fueled by sacrifices and warp fire, their output rivaling the might of entire loyalist sectors. The galaxy had never seen such creations before, and it would never be free of them afterward. For though many were destroyed in the fires of the heresy, many more survived, scattering across the void, hidden in renegade fleets buried in secret vaults, or worshipped as relics on distant, corrupted worlds. The Imperium called them abominations, heresies given form. But to the dark Mechanicum, they were perfection proof that the barrier between flesh, machine, and demon was not a boundary, but an opportunity. To them, these engines of damnation were not errors, but revelations, the truest expression of what the Mechanicum was always meant to be. And in the silence after battle, as smoke cleared and wreckage cooled, the faint hum of their engines always remained, like a sermon echoing across eternity. The first true battles against these engines revealed the depth of the dark Mechanicum's blasphemy. On the plains of Orestes, where loyalist regiments of the Astra Militarum had dug deep trenches and fortified their lines, they expected to face traitor Instead, they beheld the crawling silhouettes of demon engines advancing under a blood-red sky. At first, the soldiers mistook them for tanks, until the machines moved on to many legs, their hulls rippling as if alive, their cannons moaning before each discharge. The first volley tore through bunkers like parchment. The second volley sang in voices the soldiers could hear even through their helmets, voices that whispered their names, promising an end to fear if only they surrendered. Within hours, the lines broke. Survivors later claimed they had seen faces pressing against the armor of the machines, eyes blinking open across their surfaces. None could fire upon such things without feeling they were killing not enemies, but prisoners begging for release. Elsewhere, on the forge world of Calibra, corrupted titans walked against their loyalist kin. The ground quaked as the engines of Mars clashed in a duel that was less a battle and more a liturgy of annihilation. The loyalist titan, its banners tattered but still bearing the Imperial Aquila, marched with hymns blasting from its vox grills. Across the wasteland strode its traitor brother, its armor festooned with writhing chains, its void shields flickering like oily flames. When its plasma annihilator fired, the shot was accompanied not by the crack of energy, but by a scream so loud it shattered windows miles away. Witnesses described it as the voice of a titan's murdered machine spirit, bound eternally to its corrupted husk. When the two giants met, the clash sent firestorms whipping across the plains, and in the end, both fell, one collapsing in silence, the other exploding in a maelstrom of warp fire that left nothing but glassed earth where it had stood. The reputation of these creations spread quickly, and with it, fear. To hear that the dark Mechanicum's engines had been deployed was often enough to shatter the morale of loyalist forces before the first shot was fired. Even Astartes, bred for war and schooled in fearlessness, found themselves unsettled when facing these constructs. Some chaplains declared that fighting against such machines was not merely battle, but spiritual warfare. They urged their warriors to recite litanies of protection, to silence the whispers that wormed into their minds through corrupted vox chambers. But even these prayers were not always enough. Entire squads disappeared in the presence of certain engines, vanishing into the warp without a trace, their deaths marked only by the mocking laughter of machine spirits long since enslaved. The skies, too, became haunted. Dark Mechanicum warships stalked the void with hunger, hunting convoys and ambushing loyalist fleets. Imperial Navy officers who faced them spoke of ships that bled, their hulls glistening with ichor that froze in the vacuum, of gun batteries that roared like beasts in agony, of void shields that shimmered with images of screaming faces. Boarding these vessels was nearly impossible, for their corridors shifted and twisted, bulkheads sealing with predatory speed. More than one boarding party was crushed within the belly of a living ship, their deaths becoming sacrifices to whatever demon had been bound into its core. Those few who returned often carried madness with them, their voices broken. their minds replaying the whispers that had seeped into them during their short time inside. And still, the Dark Mechanicum refined their craft. Every battle was not only a test of strength, but an experiment. What would happen if a demon was bound into a weapon of orbital range? What would result from infusing a reactor with the soul of a living planet's population? These were not hypotheticals to the Dark Mechanicum. They were projects, trials, blueprints made real. Failures littered the void, drifting hulks, leaking warp flame. But successes endured, and each success was a testament to a doctrine that no loyalist creed could match. The engines of damnation became more than tools of war. They became symbols. For the Dark Mechanicum, they were proof of liberation. Proof that the machine god had never been a god at all, but a cage. For the Imperium, they were omens, proof that the galaxy itself could be corrupted, reshaped into something unrecognizable, something alive in all the wrong ways. And on every world touched by their presence, even after the engines withdrew, the soil remained poisoned, the air thick with whispers, as though the machines had left fragments of their hunger behind. The galaxy was beginning to learn that death at the hands of these creations was not the worst fate. To be consumed by them, to be bound into their engines, to have one's soul welded into steel, that was the true damnation. The fires of the heresy eventually dimmed, but the shadows cast by the engines of damnation did not fade. Even after the War Master lay broken on the deck of the Vengeful Spirit, even after the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, the creations of the Dark Mechanicum endured. They were too numerous, too dispersed, too entrenched in the chaos of war to be purged. Where loyalist forces dismantled one corrupted manufactorum, 3 more stirred to life in forgotten systems, fueled by desperation, ambition, and the endless hunger of the warp. On shattered battlefields, wrecks of demon engines lay half-buried in the soil, their hulks cold but never entirely dead. Soldiers spoke of the silence near such carcasses, a silence that hummed faintly as though something within still listened. Scavengers who approached too closely sometimes vanished, leaving only twisted remains fused to the wreck, as if the machine had awakened briefly to claim one more soul. Loyalist commanders ordered these hulks destroyed, their remains atomized or cast into the sun, yet many escaped destruction, scavenged by heretics, hidden in vaults by rogue tech priests, or dragged into the warp by retreating fleets. The persistence of these engines ensured their reputation. Grew beyond battle reports, they became myth. To the Imperium's rank and file, the name Dark Mechanicum was a curse. A whispered warning passed through the trenches. Beware the machines that breathe. Beware the cannons that laugh. To children raised in hive slums, they became monsters in cautionary tales, the machine that comes for disobedient souls, the war engine that walks the night. But to those who served chaos, they became sacred relics, proof of the bargains that had reshaped reality. Some war bands of traitor Astartes built their entire identities around such engines. The Iron Warriors, ever obsessed with siegecraft, coveted demon-forged artillery pieces that could tear through bastions in a single scream. The Word-bearers carried demon engines into their dark crusades as living icons of their faith. Even the Night Lords, who had once scorned ritual, could not resist the terror such constructs instilled in their victims. Across the galaxy, wherever the ruinous powers spread, the creations of the Dark Mechanicum marched beside them, their howls announcing wars that never truly ended. But even beyond the traitor legions, fragments of these engines lingered within the Imperium itself. In the secrecy of vaults buried deep beneath loyalist forge worlds, tech priests studied captured remains. Officially, such research was forbidden, outlawed by decree of the Fabricator General and the High Lords of Terra. But in whispers, in locked laboratories, some dared to study the forbidden blueprints. They justified their sins as necessity, as preparation, as knowledge that could defend humanity against future heresy. Yet the Dark Mechanicum's genius was a poisoned gift. To study their engines was to risk contamination, for the designs themselves seemed alive, whispering to those who read them, suggesting modifications that no sane priest should ever consider. So the legacy of the engines of damnation became twofold. In the Eye of Terror, they multiplied freely, unbound by law, their forges singing with demonic voices. In the Imperium, they haunted the edges of secrecy, inspiring both fear and forbidden fascination. Neither side could erase them, for they were no longer mere machines. They had become archetypes of corruption, as eternal as the warp itself. Some whispered that the Dark Mechanicum's greatest creations were never even unleashed during the heresy, that deep in the vaults of Mars, or in hidden stations drifting in the void, prototypes slumbered, engines so immense, so blasphemous, that even Horus had hesitated to awaken them. If true, then the heresy was not the height of the Dark Mechanicum's power, but merely its prologue. The galaxy may never know the full extent of what their bargains wrought, only that each echo of their forges carried with it a promise that the Dark Mechanicum had not been defeated, only delayed. The heresy ended, but the sermons of steel and flesh continued. Every demon engine that strode forth, every corrupted titan that bellowed across a battlefield, every void ship that wept ichor into the stars, was proof that the engines of damnation were not artifacts of the past. They were living doctrines, spreading wherever ambition and desperation allowed them to take root. And so the Imperium lives with a constant shadow. It can defeat armies, burn heretic worlds, and silence traitor legions. But it can never erase the bargains that birthed these engines. For the Dark Mechanicum taught the galaxy a truth the Imperium dared not admit, that machines, once corrupted, do not simply die. They endure, they whisper, they wait. The schism had shattered Mars, and the engines of damnation had scarred the galaxy. But the Dark Mechanicum's true power was never measured only in steel or fire. Their reach extended through silence, through whispers carried on vox waves, through rumors traded in the shadows of crumbling where the Emperor's decrees were shouted from marble balconies. The Dark Mechanicum's words crept like oil, seeping into the cracks of desperation. They did not conquer every world with titans or demon engines. They conquered with promises. Across the galaxy, as the heresy bled into retreat and the traitors fled into the eye, there remained countless planets abandoned, stranded, or half. Governors who had once sworn loyalty to Terra found their warehouses empty, their soldiers starving, their forges silent. For them, the Imperium's silence was not faith, but abandonment. And in that void of aid, the Dark Mechanicum's emissaries arrived. They did not march beneath banners, but walked in secrecy. Draped in robes that whispered against the dust, their augmetics humming with hidden voices, they offered miracles. A hive crippled by plague would awaken to find emissaries in the governor's court, offering a cure that required no medicine but a device etched with runes. The machine would hum, the sick would rise, and the city would call it salvation. Only later would the governor notice that the healed walked differently, their eyes reflecting light that was not natural. A garrison on the verge of collapse would suddenly receive a shipment of weapons. Lasguns that struck with unnatural force, armor that sealed itself when pierced. The battle would be won, the world saved. Only afterward would soldiers whisper that their rifles laughed when they fired, or that their armor whispered commands in their sleep. These whispers spread like a plague of thought. Not all who heard them accepted, but enough did, for desperation is fertile ground, and ambition hungers for shortcuts. Each whispered bargain became a seed planted in the galaxy, and the Dark Mechanicum knew that seeds grow best in silence. They did not need armies to corrupt the Imperium. They only needed men and women willing to barter their souls for survival. Even the Astartes were not untouched. Some legions that had broken with Horus but hesitated at the abyss found themselves courted by these whispers. A warpsmith here, a tech marine there. Lured with promises of knowledge denied by the Mechanicum loyalists of Mars. The gifts were subtle at first, a weapon schematic forgotten in a reactor design that pulsed with impossible efficiency. Then came the bargains proper. Entire war bands of traitor marines bound themselves to the Dark Mechanicum's forges, swearing their oaths as much to Mars's corrupted kin as to the dark gods themselves. And still, the Imperium tried to silence the whispers. Edicts were issued, entire systems purged, suspected forges glassed from orbit, but whispers cannot be burned. They cling to survivors, to memory, to rumor. The Dark Mechanicum thrived on secrecy, on half-truths that could not be proven. Every loyalist who claimed to have seen a weapon alive with demon fire was dismissed as superstitious. Every report of machines healing themselves was labeled exaggeration. And yet, in the silence of midnight, governors and generals still listened for those whispers, still wondered if the price of survival might be worth the risk. For this was the Dark Mechanicum's greatest weapon, It was enough for the galaxy to believe they could be anywhere. Watching from the shadows of their ruined manufactoria, their voices carried on currents of binary static that might be mistaken for mere interference. The Emperor's servants preached faith, loyalty, sacrifice. The Dark Mechanicum preached only a single creed, bargain. And in a galaxy torn by war, bargains are always heard. The bargains of the Dark Mechanicum spread most easily in times of weakness, and the galaxy offered no shortage of fractures. In one war-torn sector near the Maelstrom, an Imperial governor watched his armies dwindle, his fleet shattered by raiders, his manufactoria unable to supply even basic munitions. He prayed to Terra, sending astropathic pleas across the void, but weeks stretched into months without response. Then one night, when the last bastion's walls shook under bombardment, a figure entered his chamber. The emissary's robes were crimson once, now blackened with soot and oil, his face hidden behind a vox mask that whispered with layered voices. He offered not promises of salvation, but a single data slate. On it were schematics for weapons the governor had never imagined. "Build these," the emissary said, "and you will not fall." The governor obeyed. Within weeks, his enemies were annihilated by machines that shrieked with every shot. He had saved his world. But his people no longer looked at him with loyalty, only fear. For the machines he had unleashed never returned to their vaults, but patrolled on their own, as though the world itself now belonged to them. In another tale, whispered among void, a renegade fleet drifted starving through the dark between stars. Their holds were empty, their reactors failing, their crew reduced to gnawing on corpse flesh. In the stillness of the void, a signal came, not astropathic, not imperial, but a binary hymn that infected every cogitator aboard. Those who heard it reported visions, forges burning with unholy light, engines that beat like hearts, ships that bled and healed themselves. When they followed the signal, they found a station hidden in the black, a forge built on no charted map. The priests who welcomed them were pale and half metallic, their voices harmonizing with the static hum of the machinery. The fleet left that station with full holds, refitted warships, and weapons unholy in design. They swore themselves to the Dark Mechanicum, and in return, they survived. No Imperial patrol ever found them again. Even Terra itself was not free from whispers. Loyalist records are fragmentary, redacted, buried under layers of secrecy. But rumors persist of emissaries caught attempting to infiltrate the palace during the years after the heresy. Some whispered that they sought to corrupt the Astronomicon itself to twist the beacon into something more sinister. Others claimed they merely wished to plant seeds of doubt among the Mechanicum still loyal to the Emperor, suggesting that the true Omnissiah was the one who answered, not the one who sat silent on the golden throne. Whether these rumors were truth or fabrication, they spread like cracks through marble, unsettling even the most devout. For if the Dark Mechanicum could reach the throne world, where else could they not? The infiltration was not always grand. Sometimes it was as small as a whisper in a worker's ear. A laborer in a forge might dream of a new tool, one that never dulled, and awakened to find the blueprint on his workbench. A skittery might hear a new litany in the static of his comes, one that promised victory in exchange for a single act of disobedience. Even the smallest seed could grow into corruption, and the Dark Mechanicum knew well how to sow such seeds. They did not need armies. They needed only patience. The Imperium's response was brutal. Purges were ordered, cities burned, forge worlds silenced by orbital fire. But such violence often fed the very fear that Dark Mechanicum thrived upon. Every purge left survivors, and survivors carried whispers. In time, the people of the Imperium began to believe that the Dark Mechanicum could never truly be destroyed. For how can one burn silence? How can one purge a whisper? And so the galaxy lived in unease. It was not only the engines of damnation that haunted them, but the knowledge that the Dark Mechanicum's reach extended where no army could. They were the shadow behind every failing machine, the voice behind every flicker of static, the bargain offered in every desperate hour. They were not simply forges lost to the warp. They were an idea, and ideas cannot be killed with fire or blade. The whispers of the Dark Mechanicum were never content to remain as rumor. Over centuries, they hardened into doctrine, spreading like veins through the galaxy's fractured body. To some, they became liturgies recited in secret. Binary prayers, muttered by low-born priests who dared not voice their doubts openly. To others, they were practical truths. Strategies whispered from one commander to another. If the Imperium abandons you, there are other forges that will not. Over time, the distinction between rumor and reality blurred, until it no longer mattered whether the dark Mechanicum was truly present. The belief that they could be was enough. In certain hive worlds, the whispers became urban legend. Workers claimed to hear voices in the static of cogitators, offering them respite from endless toil. Whole shifts would vanish, swallowed by the promise of easier labor and greater reward. Later, their families would swear that they returned, not as men and women, but as something else, bodies moving too stiffly, eyes glowing faintly with unnatural light. In other systems, soldiers returning from campaigns whispered of machines that fought beside them, never failing, never faltering, but always demanding blood in payment. Such tales spread faster than Imperial censors could suppress, becoming fireside warnings, then half-believed truths, and finally, foundations for cults. Even among the Mechanicum loyal to Terra, the whispers left scars. There were always those who wondered why the Emperor remained silent, why the Omnissiah seemed distant, why the machine god never answered with the same immediacy the dark Mechanicum promised. Some tech priests cloaked their doubts in prayer, burying their questions beneath layers of liturgy. Others, however, sought answers in secrecy. They told themselves they studied the corrupted designs only to better understand their enemy. But in truth, fascination carried them further. For knowledge, once tasted, is never easily forgotten. The whispers fed that hunger, promising revelations that loyalist catechisms never offered. Over centuries, this doctrine of whispers became a second faith, not a church of marble and light, but a shadowed cult that lived in between the words of the Creed Mechanicus. Its teachings were simple. The Emperor is silent, but the warp is not. The Omnissiah withholds, but the dark gods give. The machine is not sacred, but malleable. It was a faith of pragmatism, of hunger, of ambition. It spread not by conquest, but by invitation. Always whispered, never shouted, always offered, never forced. The choice was the trap. Once a bargain was accepted, there was no path back, and so the whispers endured through the ages. Carried from world to world, fleet to fleet, like a plague without a cure, they became part of the background noise of the galaxy, indistinguishable from the static that filled every vox channel, from the hum of every reactor. To some, that hum was the sound of loyalty. To others, it was the voice of opportunity, waiting to be heard. The dark Mechanicum did not seek power only in the moment, nor glory bound to the age of Horus. Their bargains were never intended to end with war. From the very beginning, they sought eternity. To them, flesh was temporary, machines fragile, even demons fickle, but a pact, a binding covenant between man, machine, and the warp that was eternal. And through that pact, they believed they could transcend every boundary the galaxy had imposed upon them. The loyalist Mechanicum prayed to the Omnissiah for preservation, for continuity, for the stability of the sacred order. The dark Mechanicum laughed at such restraint. Where the Imperium clung to liturgy, they embraced hunger. To them, eternity was not found in worship, but in transformation. They sought to rewrite the very definition of existence, fusing the enduring cruelty of the warp with the permanence of steel. A tech priest who gave himself to this creed did not die when his body failed. His essence was bound into machines, into demons, into creations that would walk long after his name was forgotten in the hidden forges. Rituals emerged that were no longer surgeries or augmentations, but full-blown. A priest would lay himself upon a slab of blackened iron, and with chants of binary and blasphemy, his flesh would be peeled away. His mind poured into cogitators fed by demonic entities. Sometimes the result was a towering war engine that bore his voice forever in its foxhorns. Sometimes it was a half-living machine, suspended in endless pain, but never silenced. Sometimes it was nothing but failure, a scream, a flicker, a presence lost into the warp. Yet the failures did not dissuade them. Every sacrifice was another experiment, another step toward eternity. These pacts went beyond individual priests. Entire forged worlds swore themselves to the dark gods, binding their populations into collective covenants. Factories were consecrated not with oils of sanctity, but with blood, their conveyor lines carrying not ore but flayed skin. Their reactors, fueled by sacrifices, whispered into the warp. Such worlds became shrines of eternal pact-making, where the line between machine and demon was erased. Travelers who stumbled upon them and survived spoke of manufactoria that breathed, of towers that shifted as though alive, of skies that bled light instead of rain. To live there was to be part of the pact, whether willingly or not. But the question always lingered, even among their own, who truly held the covenant. The priests told themselves they were masters, that they had bound demons into contracts and forced them to obey. Yet demons do not bargain, as mortals do. Their gifts always concealed hunger, their promises always coiled with teeth. For every priest who believed himself immortal, bound into the eternal forge, there was the quiet, unsettling possibility that he had not bound the warp, but had been bound by it. The eternal pact, some whispered, was not theirs at all. It was the warp's, and they were simply its servants. Clothed in iron dot, the Imperium called this heresy of the highest order, yet they never understood its true scale. For the Dark Mechanicum did not need victory in open battle. They needed only to endure, to persist, to plant their covenants like seeds in the soil of the galaxy. Every engine that walked, every weapon that whispered, every forge that smoldered with forbidden fire was part of their eternal pact. Even when armies fell, when worlds were cleansed, when records were erased, the pact remained, echoing in the silence of forgotten humming in the static of abandoned cogitators. And so, the Dark Mechanicum survived the heresy, survived the millennia that followed, and survived still. Their forges burn not only in the Eye of Terror, but in the forgotten corners of the Imperium, in the shadows of hive worlds, in the locked chambers of traitor fleets. Their eternity is not a dream. It is a reality the galaxy cannot erase. The Imperium believes itself unyielding, its throne eternal, its legions undying. Yet in the quiet between battles, in the humming silence of Manufactoria, the truth whispers otherwise. The eternal pacts of the Dark Mechanicum have outlived wars, outlasted crusades, and endured long after the banners of Horus were burned to ash. Their genius lies not in overwhelming conquest, but in infection. They do not need to defeat the Imperium outright. They need only to endure, to embed themselves in hidden corners, to bind their bargains into the very fabric of machinery upon which humanity depends. Consider the void ships that cross the stars, each one a cathedral of steel. How many of their reactors still bear the touch of pacts struck during the heresy? How many cogitators deep in their cores hum with code that is not entirely loyal, not entirely sane? The Imperium cannot abandon these vessels. They are its lifeblood. And yet, unknowingly, it carries the legacy of the Dark Mechanicum within its fleets. Each jump through the warp, each hum of the engines, each whisper of static across the coms may echo with the remnants of bargains. Struck 10,000 years ago, even the forge worlds that remain loyal are not immune. Their priests perform rituals older than memory, reciting litanies that stave off corruption. Yet how many of those rituals contain words inserted by traitor hands? How many blueprints passed down as sacred tradition carry subtle alterations that no loyalist dares question? For the Dark Mechanicum, eternity was never about building armies alone. It was about embedding themselves in the very bones of the Imperium, ensuring their bargains would echo forever. There are worlds where this truth cannot be denied. In the Eye of Terror, forge worlds blaze with unnatural light, their skies torn by warp storms, their spires crowned with icons of both steel and demon. These are not factories, but living shrines, where entire populations are part of the pact, their flesh woven into conveyor belts, their voices echoing as choir song through reactor chambers. From these hellforges, new engines march without end, bound to the service of traitor legions and renegade lords. But beyond the eye, the truth is subtler, more insidious. A forge world deemed loyal may still carry hidden vaults, sealed chambers where whispered bargains echo. The priests who serve there may not even know the corruption lingers, but the pact endures regardless, a parasite that never dies. This is why the Dark Mechanicum has never truly been defeated. Armies can be crushed, heretics executed, Manufactoria glassed from orbit, yet the eternal pact survives in fragments, in whispers, in blueprints, half remembered. Every time a desperate governor or warlord listens to static and hears a voice offering salvation, the pact renews. Every time a soldier lifts a weapon that feels too perfect, too alive, the pact grows. And every time a tech priest questions the Emperor's silence, wondering if the Omnissiah ever truly answers, the pact waits. Some within the Imperium admit this in secret. There are inquisitors who believe the dark Mechanicum has already succeeded, that the Imperium itself runs on corrupted machinery, its great engines bound by bargains made long ago. If true, then the Imperium does not merely battle the dark Mechanicum, it carries them, sustains them, feeds them unknowingly. The Astronomicon burns, the Golden Throne groans, the forges of Mars roar, and who can say how much of that fire, how much of that power, is entirely pure? The Eternal Pact is not a prophecy. It is not a promise. It is a reality written into the veins of the galaxy itself. Machines may rust, flesh may rot, but bargains endure. They do not age, they do not falter, they do not die. They simply wait, whispering in the dark, patient as the void. And when the galaxy falters, as it always does, the pacts are remembered. The whispers grow louder, and the dark Mechanicum endures once more. The galaxy drifts in cycles of war, empires rising and falling, stars burning and dying. Yet the pacts of the dark Mechanicum endure like scars across eternity. For while the Imperium shouts its creed from pulpits and carves its laws into stone, the dark Mechanicum whispers. They are patient, they are persistent, and in the long silence between wars, their voices are always there, waiting to be heard. Those who have glimpsed their forges describe them as nightmares. Given structure, they speak of manufactoria that pulse like organs, their conveyor lines carrying not ore but beating hearts, their engines venting, not steam but whispers. They tell of priests whose bodies are no longer bodies at all, but frameworks of cables and rusted bone, their eyes hollow, their mouths filled with static. These priests do not beg for faith, for they have no need. They offer only bargains. And for every bargain refused, there are 10 more accepted in a galaxy built on desperation. They cannot lose. What gives their eternal pact its power is not conquest, but inevitability. Every war breeds desperation. Every famine breeds ambition. Every silence from Terra breeds doubt. The dark Mechanicum thrives on these fractures, for where there is need, there will always be ears ready to listen. No matter how many times the Imperium burns their forges, silences their cults, or destroys their engines, the pacts return. A whisper on a Kumchano, a blueprint left in a forgotten vault, a voice in the dreams of a weary priest. Always they return. Some claim that even the Emperor himself, seated upon the Golden Throne, hears their whispers in the silence between his labored breaths. They say the dark Mechanicum offers even him a bargain, freedom from the throne, life renewed, power without end. Whether this is truth or heresy is irrelevant, for the rumor alone serves the pact. For if the Emperor could be tempted, could anyone resist? Such tales are condemned as blasphemy, yet they linger, passed from one terrified voice to another. Adding to the weight of inevitability, the Eternal Pact does not promise victory. It does not need to. It promises survival. It promises that as long as there are machines, there will be hunger. As long as there is flesh, there will be bargains. The galaxy is vast, the Imperium sprawling, but no fortress is so secure that whispers cannot enter. No creed so strong that doubt cannot take root. The dark Mechanicum has no need for thrones or crowns. Their empire is silence. Their dominion is patience. And their victory is time itself. And so, 10,000 years after the schism of Mars, their shadow still stretches across the stars. Their engines march beside traitor legions. Their bargains fuel wars the Imperium dares not name. Their whispers seep into the cracks of loyalty. Always present, always patient. In the eye of terror, their forges blaze without end. In the Imperium, their echoes linger in the shadows of manufactoria, in the hum of cogitators, in the static of vox waves. They are both absent and present, defeated and victorious, silent and eternal. The galaxy may one day burn, the Astronomicon may flicker and die, the throne may collapse into dust. But when that day comes, the pacts of the dark Mechanicum will remain, for their empire was never built on thrones of stone or banners of silk. It was built on bargains, and bargains do not die. They endure, whispered from one desperate soul to the next, across centuries, across wars, across the stars. And so the question lingers, carried on every signal, hidden in every machine, waiting in every silence. How many of us have already bargained without knowing? How many of us already serve their eternal pact? The dark Mechanicum does not need to answer. Their silence is answer enough.